Okay, good morning. So we continue the Seder Hishtalshels that I was going over reviewing. I already finished Elam Asiyah, Hagashmi, Hachumri. So it would seem like we have nothing more to cover, but there's plenty more to cover. Even in the Seder Advarim, what I want to do now, since we're going Mamayel Lamata from the highest levels in Ruchnius and Alakus to the lowest levels, Tachtenim, in the language of the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, Perek Lamed Vov, Tachtenim in the Gili and Helam of Alakus, because it's not Mokim, Alter Rebbe says, but Tachtenim means in the lowest level of Gili, or we should say the highest level of Helam, to the point that it's Tachten Shein Tachten Lamatim Memenu. I think the next piece should be, let's cover what that means, and specifically the next words in Tanya, which is Mole Klippos v'sitra achra. Is there a Tanya here? Someone can bring me a Tanya. There is a Tanya in this Kel? Good. Thank you. So what I want to cover is that. What does that mean? Klippos v'sitra achra. Mole Klippos v'sitra achra. So in the context of what we've been discussing, obviously, in Asiyah itself, you have Asiyah Ruchnius, you have levels of Asiyah that are very high levels. You have even Malachim in Asiyah. When we say Srofim, Chayes, Veifanim, Efani HaKedesh are in Asiyah. But in Asiyah itself, just like in the rest of Ishtalshalos, everything goes Darga, Ladarga, Ladarga. So I'll just use let's just read the language in Tanya itself. Alter Rebbe says like this. Then I want to go over to a Sikha from the Rebbe. The Rebbe explains it. Okay, so of course the famous Tanya, Hine Medar Zeis, Ma'amed Azal, Shetachlis Brias Elam Hazeh, Hushe Nisava Kosh Baruch Liyas Leidir B'Tachtenim. Hine Leishayach Lefonav Yizborah B'Chinis Mailo Mata. So what means Tachtenim? The Eibusha desire there should be a Dira B'Tachtenim. There's no Mailo Mata, K'Yiz Baruch Malak Kalalman. Elabira Inyan, I'm just skipping down to the Loshen that we're talking, that there's no Shinui, Elikus is everywhere, but there's Levushim Rabim Amachasum Mastirim Eidiyas Baruch. K'Diksiv K'Lei Reini Odem B'Chai, K'Dpirush Azal, Shafil Malachim Anikraim Chayis, Ein Rein, and that is Zeu In Ishtalshus Se'elim is V'Didasam in Madrega LeMadrega. That's what Ishtalshalos means. That's going from level to level. What does level mean? So in Gashmi, it's Mokim Gashmi, level to level means first you're on the 5th floor, you go to the 4th floor, the 3rd floor, the 2nd floor, the 1st floor. Obviously, that's not Shaykh, like you said, Mokim Gashmi. So Madrega LeMadrega, the Rebbe is Levushim HaMastirim Ha'er. So it's all about Echus. In other words, the Rambam says Mokim is from the word Maila, from the word quality. So you say a higher level means a higher quality, not a higher physical space. That basically the concept that Atzilus is not in the sky, and Bria is not lower than Atzilus as in the hierarchy of physical structure. So it's Madrega Ha'er V'Chai Shemenis Baruch Ad Shenivru. Here's the main lashon. Elam Hazeh Hagashmi V'Achumri Mamish. So you see, every word is B'diuk. Elam Hazeh, which is Gashmi, physical. Chumri means also more than just physical. Chumri is a shtickle, like grobkeit, which is crassness. Mamish. And that's the lowest level. Nothing can be lower. What means lower? Be'inyan hester eriyus baruch. So lower means in the amount of concealment, it can't be more concealed than this. Then he continues, Alter Rebbe doesn't stop. V'cheshech kofel mechupel, and it's a darkness, a double darkness, and a double darkness, like a quadruple darkness. Cheshech, kofel, and mechupel. Ad, to the extent, shu mole Klippos v'sitra achra, filled with Klippos and sitra achra, shein neged Hashem mamish. So in other words, it's not just concealed. Now we're talking about isnagdus. You could have godliness is concealed, but there's no opposition. Here it's neged Hashem mamish, leimer ani v'afsiyed. Okay, then the Alter Rebbe continues what the tachlis of all this is. What's all the point of such a yirid, such concealment? Is to make a dira b'tachtenim dafke in a state where it's so concealed to the point of aniva afseir is like the ultimate neged Hashem mamish. So there's a letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe, and I'll tell you where it is, in case you want to look it up, that he explains every one of these levels, literally. So there's a lot of dargis here if you start reading it. Gashmi, Chumri, Tachten, Madrege, Hester, Yisborach, Cheshach, Kofel, Mechupel, Atshum Mole, Klippah, Neged Hashem. So there's a lot of levels here, and you're not going to find a lot from the Rebbe. The Rebbe has, of course, in his Pirushim on Tanya, he explains some of the words here, and other Rabbeim as well. But there is an interesting sikha, I would say a fascinating sikha. I think would be one of those that I would say must learn sikhas. You say this dik. It's Mikes Tov Shemem Zayin. Rebbe's Magiyat. Shabbos Pasha Mikes Tov Shemem Zayin. That's what I'm looking up right now. It's printed in the Esopus of Chelik Chof Hei, Kute Sikhas, and also in Sefer Sikhas Tov Shemem Zayin now. So what does he say here? So I'm just going to the sikh, and he quotes that letter as well. Why is it not coming up here? Okay, here we are. So without going to the whole theme of the sikha, it's a Chanukah-related sikha. That year, Chanukah, Shabbos Chanukah were 2 Shabbos Chanukas, which is very rare. The first day of Chanukah and the last day of Chanukah, Shabbos. And so they say an extra Haftarah, which is, as I said, very rarely said. And the Haftarah is about Asiyas Kelim. The Haftarah of the second Shabbos Chanukah is Vayash Chirem. But the interesting thing, according to our minig and many minhagim, the Haftarah stops after Chirem built the Kelim for the Bayis edition, for the first Beis HaMikdash. The Psukim continue, and they talk about not just the building of the Kelim, but then bringing the Kelim into the Beis HaMikdash, and then using the Kelim. So the Rebbe asked the question, the whole focus of the Haftarah is only on making Kelim. The tafkid of the Keli is not to make it, it's to use it. So at least it should talk about bringing them into a few psukim extra in the Haftarah should be to bring them into the Beis HaMikdash. Even more, to have them be used. That's the Nekudas HaDover, and the Rebbe's answer is from the Tanya Perek Lamed Vav. That the main Aveda of Dira B'Tachtenim is to make from a world that is completely concealed, Tachten Shein Tachtel Matmen, to the point of Neged Hashem Mamish, that should be a Keli Telekus. Once it's a Keli, then the rest is called like Gilei Helam, then it's just a matter. The Rebbe actually gives an example at the end of the Sikha, a pretty powerful example, that when you meet a Eid, and even if you don't put on tefillin with him, or he doesn't do a mitzvah, you just say to him, good morning, you made him a Keli. Obviously the kavanah is you should do the mitzvah. But the fact that you said good morning, said good morning, so he's warmed up, and now he's a Keli, so next time somebody meets him, he'll be more receptive. The real challenge in this world is to make the world a Keli Telekus. And then the rest will follow. Which also explains the whole idea why mitzvah gereres mitzvah, and the Rebbe didn't say, many people have tainus. You meet Eden, you're just going to be kind to them, invite them for Shabbos. No, you have to make them Shem Neter mitzvah. The answer is make them a Keli, and then they'll automatically become Shem Neter mitzvah. And that's the Rebbe's main chiddush in this sikha. But in doing so, when he explains the Tanya, the Rebbe says a few things. I'm going to read from a few points. I want to then elaborate on it because it really gives us a good sense of what this whole idea of what this world is made of. Bottom line is everything we discussed is not this world. Everything we talked about, say, the Shtalshalus, is Negeya, and it's part of the whole picture, but the world we live in, but Poel Mamish, is a world that is described in Perek Lamed Vav, Acheshach Kofel Mechupel. So even if we say, and the Rebbe says we're at the end of Birurim and Mashiach is right here, we have to open our eyes, the Rebbe never said that the Cheshach is not there anymore. It means we still have to open our eyes. So it's a Cheshach Kofel Mechupel, and you see B'Poel, that most of the world is either not godly or even negative helikus. So understanding what this world is like from a perspective of Chassidus is extremely important because we don't live in Atzilus. We want to be Mamshech Atzilus here, and we want Elikus Begolah, that's the whole Kavanah. But b'poil, we have to understand what this world is like. It's like Yediyas hamachla chetzi refuah. You can't heal something if you don't know what the problem is. So this is not meant to depress us. In other words, it's not like I say from Musa telling us that this world is full of is just evil and dark, and we have to always be threatened by it and frightened and hide and run from it. But adarabah, we know our shlichus is to enter this world, not be despoiled from the darkness, and change it, to be transformed darkness to light. I mean, you say this of Kol HaTeira, especially Chassidus, just like in this week's parsha, Vayetzi Yaakov miBe'er Sheva Vayelech Charona. Charona is Charei Nafshal Mokim. It's not a pleasant place. The Armumius, the conniving, lying, deceiving Lavan. But Dafka, that's where the Eibishter wants Yaakov to build his home. For that's the Yom of Kedma, from Dafka, from Charon, not from Be'er Sheva. Be'er Sheva is Taka Hai Madrege. The Erechaim says, Sheva, Be'er Sheva, Sheva Midas, Atzilus, and so on. So the theme is a central theme wherever you go, and especially, of course, we know in Deir HaShvi, to make a dira b'tachteim, at-tachten shein tachten l'mata mimenu. If that was not the yesod, the Rebbe would not have sent shluchim everywhere. You could stay wherever you are and be a shem b'teira mitzvahs. Even that we know is also in the dark world, wherever you are. But we go dafka to places where it's even darker. And it's all based on this yesod. So understanding, basically what we're talking about is understanding the anatomy, dissecting the anatomy of the cheshach is extremely critical to understand what you're confronting, and of course with the goal of transforming it. That's not just here to, a doctor comes to heal. He needs to understand the disease in order to find how to heal it. So that's essentially what this piece is about. So the Rebbe says, I'm going to read a few selections. I'm reading from, again, Miketz Tovshim Mem Zayin. Shabbos Pasha Miketz Tovshim Mem Zayin. If you want to look in Likud Six Chelik Chafei, I'm reading right now on page 427. I'm not just saying it for you here in the room, also for anyone who's listening or will listen later. So, let's see here. Okay, the Rebbe brings first of all the Tanya, quotes the whole Tanya. Says, "Yedua as tachlis kavanas b'ris elam is nesava kadosh baruch hu liyaslei dira b'tachtein." Good. Then he quotes the whole piece I just read till aniva avsied. Unamen shal yidei avedose b'teira mitzvahs. The Rebbe continues. So mevatel zayin zerbrechen de Klippahs v'sitra achra. The lashon that Alter Rebbe brought saying more the Klippahs v'sitra achra zerbrechen ze. Machen de dvarim gashmim shebe'elam. So to break meaning to crack. The Klippah, we'll talk about that shortly, why it's called a Klippah. But more than that, to make the Dvarim Gashim Shebe'elim, which is Tachtenim, Kelim Selakus. Kelim Selakus. Ka diskafi sitrachel v'sapach hashechel neheder sheyoyer Eir Hashem ein sei baruch hu b'mokam hacheshech v'sitrachel shel kol ha'elam hazeh kulei b'yesa seis v'yesa reis v'yisa ne'er min hacheshech. Good. This is all from Tanya Perek Lamed Vav. Now here's where I want to go. So now, just give me a minute, I'm just going through the exact lashon. Yeah, okay. The Rebbe continues and explains that the question now is like this: is Klippos and Sitra Achra and the Helam a dover nesef an Elam Hazeh, or is it the Etzem Mahus of Elam Hazeh? And the Rebbe makes it very clear it's the Etzem Mahus. Because if you say it's a dover nesef, so really in other words, Elam Hazeh is just another world of Elokus. And then there was some additional thing that was added called a Helam. But then it's not a Dira B'Tachtein. Then you're just removing the Helam. So the Rebbe makes a whole case here where he says, when it's Zetzach Elam de Gedusha, V'Slachatchila Kelitz Elokus, or at least Rishus. So there you don't have to make it a Keli. The Baldober is Elam Hazeh Tachten is Mailam a Master Eif Elokus. Und das ist ein Etzem Muhus. To the point that it says, Ad Sheshmei Hameir al Muhusehu Elam. So we know the name of something is the Etzem of the thing. Elam is from the word Helam V'Hester. So Kutetera, Shlach. So the very name of this world is Elam Lashon Helam V'Hester. Wie es lachatchile b'schaffen geworden. In other words, it's not a helam due to chet etzadas or the chatoim that came afterwards. The Eibishter created the elam hazeh, elam meloshen helam and tachten. We didn't make it tachten. We may have made it worse through the chet etzadas. Well, not may, we did make it worse. But who created the helam and the tzimtzum in the first place? Is the Eibishter. Shenivra elam hazeh. The Rebbe emphasized the word shenivra. It was created. Hagashmi v'achumi mamash hu hatachtim madrega. And here the Rebbe brings the letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's a letter printed in Atomim, Igris Kedesh. It's in order 51. Shemefaret hadargis b'pchisus ha'elam. The Frierdiker Rebbe goes through the levels in how low the world is. And he says, Eisham shachesha kof l'machupel, moli Klippah sitrach, nichel b'sug echad. She'efen ha'cheshach, that the way it's cheshach is atshu hu moli Klippah sitrach. In other words, Klippah sitrach could be seen as a separate thing, but it's an extension of the cheshach. Good. But here's the next line. U'nochmer. It's not just a tachten bin hatzimtzum ereliki, nor moli Klippah sitrach she neged Hashem mamish. So the Rebbe is actually learning not like the Frierdiker Rebbe's pshat. But the Frierdiker Rebbe moli Klippos is an extension of cheshach. It's not a stira, just a different way of being magish. The Rebbe is teaching moli Klippos she neged Hashem mamish. They're not just darkness; they oppose elikus. So you could have something is not. It's like, let's say you fight a war and you have an enemy, and the enemy finally you neutralize the enemy. The enemy says, "I'm not going to fight you, but I'm also not going to support you." That's a helam. But that you can't call menagid. A menagid is, no, I'm going to befedish fight you. That's a very different matziv. So we're talking not just a helam. A helam can lead to a menagid, but a helam is lav dafka menagid. You have this all the time. A person says, I'm not getting involved. They don't take sides. But then there's a level where a person's befedish a menagid. Das heißt, a Welt, was ist mitzad atzmei noch in ganzen nicht roi, viele nicht behelem, zu sein akeli, because it's a menagid. You can't say a menagid is a keli. You can say a helam, remove the helam, and therefore the person will be a keli. But if it's a menagid, first you have to get rid of the isnagdus. So you need a shvira. You need to defeat him. You need to break something, so to speak. Is verstandig, als bei dem machen adir betachtein, is nicht maspik zu megale sein, durch die Avede beziehende mitzvahs min a helam, dem teivshe begedusha, was is behalten in the dvarim gashmin. It's not enough, because you have a menagid. But however, no, the tzud darf man ankommen zu chidush gomer, and that's making the keli. But they zerbrechen und mevatel sein the Klippos v'sitra achra, the menagid, und areisnem metaches mem shaltom the divrei reshus be'elam, und in the tzutze gedusha, that's was is behalten, that's concealed there, und sie übermachen verkelim zalikus. Kugoin, like the Alter Rebbe says in the next page, klaf hat film. So klaf itself was once the hide of an animal. So even though you can use an animal that's asheret, but let's talk about animals. The animal could be a kosher animal. It's a kosher animal. But it's hide, it's not gedusha, it's reshus, divrei reshus. It could actually be used for negative things too, as the Alter Rebbe says earlier in Tanya. You could take a dover shebe'elam and use it for destructive purposes, as we know. But what do we do when we make into a keli? You're taking the klaf. On its own, it could have been is a helam, because the klaf begoli is not yet for kedusha. It could be used for a neged, but you're taking the klaf and you iber machen fakelim tzalakus klaf hat tefillin. So you take the klaf and you makadesh it, and now it becomes the parchment for tefillin. V'chein esrig or moyes tzedakah. That's the example the Alter Rebbe gives. So now we're talking about a chidush, because you're taking something that's the etzem helam. And furthermore, menagid, and you're turning that into a keli. There's nothing greater than that. And that's why the kavan is dafke dir betachtein. And that the Rebbe then continues and says, and that's why vayaschirim is the main adgosh in the Chanukah, Zeis Chanukah of Teira, which is to make a keli. Then afterwards, the rest will follow. It's like once you have this very often, like in negotiations and business negotiations, sometimes the first person, the opener, has to eliminate the resistance from the opposition, or let's say someone who's against it. And then once they warm them up, then he leaves the room and says, okay, you take care of the rest, and already make the deal. But sometimes the biggest challenge, and I can tell you from the communication, when you're speaking and writing, the biggest challenge is not getting a message across. is getting rid of the stereotypes and the preconceived notions people have about any topic. And if you don't get rid of that, you could say the most brilliant things, but the person has another notion, they have a different perspective. And to eliminate that is much, much harder. But once you do that, then a person's already, now I understand what you're talking about. Yeah, they're open, they're keli, basically. That's the gist of the sikha. Kedai to learn it yourself, but I want to go to the sikha right now. But I want to go to ha'ara that the Rebbe himself wrote. Didn't write the whole ha'ara, but he wrote the Nekudas, and then he wrote to us that we should give Mar Mekamis to it. So the ha'ara is ha'ara 52. When the words unochmer, after the Rebbe goes from Helam v'Hester to Menagid, remember again, a Helam is not machriach a Menagid. It leaves room. Remember, there's no Helam. Eidin Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, for example, there's no Helam. So there can't be a Menagid, obviously. Because if there's no concealment, all you have is Ein Eid Milvadeh, Alakus B'Pshitas. So Helam doesn't mean Menagid. Helam leaves room for Menagid. But the Alter Rebbe Beferish says, Ad Unochmer. So the Rebbe's Medayik, that's what the Alter Rebbe means by the word Ad. Before the Rebbe wrote this, I looked in all the Mefarshim on Tanya, nobody ever was Medayik like this. The Ad is usually learned by, Balabatish. At first it's Achesha Kofle Mechupo, to the extent, Shumali Klippah sitra achra. Here's what the Rebbe writes. When he says Unochmer, Kilosh Nadmur Azokim B'Tanya Sham Ad, underline, Shumali Klippah sitra achra, V'yashlemer Hadiyuk B'zeh, Ki Moli Klippah Nasa B'Seif Maisa Bereshis. Ribu Izman La'achre Shenesava V'Nivra Ha'elam. That's what the Rebbe wrote. And then, like I said, he wrote a few other Nekudas, and that became the order which I'll read momentarily. First, let me explain this line. So this is an interesting statement here. In other words, when it says Bereshis Bar Elokim Z'Shemayim V'Sa'aretz, so we know it's Elokim, Midas Hadin, Lashon Achsidus, Tzimtzum. You can't have a world without Tzimtzum. Why? Because like the Eitz Chaim says, famous Eitz Chaim, that Lifnei Ad Shalei Nivra Elam, there was the matzav of Erein Sof Memala Kol HaMetzias V'loi Hoya Nesinas Malkam Klal Le'elamas. V'loi Hoya Nesinas Malkam Le'elamas Klal. Then comes at Tzimtzum. So the famous example, the Alter Rebbe's example, that a Rav, who's a brilliant teacher, and if he's just shining with all his glory, no student would be able to deal with it. Be overwhelming. So the Rav has to be mitzamtzim. He has to conceal his brilliance. So for him, it's not concealed. The Rav doesn't become less chacham, obviously. But for the Talmud now doesn't hear anything. The teacher's quiet. Essentially, quiet means like Helam. Then comes a stream of consciousness, what's called the kav v'chut. That's nimshach, like a spoon feeding. Aleph, Beis, Gimel. Or in the language of Chassidus, from the Eitz Chaim, the kav is chezer misagel, creates ak, for the igulim, and then yesher, etc., etc. So Bereshis Bar Elokim, you need to have tzimtzum for that. But Moli Klippah v'sitra achra was the world filled with Klippah v'sitra achra till Adam and Chava came into the world, and they had the Chet Tzadas. It's an interesting question. So I'm going to read from the Rebbe's order because there's a lot of points here to be made. But this gives us a very clear picture. We'll get a clear picture after going through this, what exactly happened here. So now let's go back to the word Klippah. But the Rebbe says clearly, Moli Klippah is Nasa B'Seif Ma'aseh Bereshis. That means Yom Shishi. Because till then, there was no Klippah v'sitra achra that we know of. But we have to define what means Klippah v'sitra achra. Helam there was. That's why it's Ad. Ad Shu Moli. And the Rebbe writes, Zibu Izman L'Achar Shenesava. I believe at the time I wrote back to the Rebbe, after he wrote it, I wrote to the Rebbe, what means Ribu Izman? What does that mean? The Sava is before the B'riyas Elam altogether. You don't even talk about Zman. But the Rebbe didn't answer. I'm almost sure I wrote, maybe not. I can't remember. I remember I was thinking of writing what means Ribu Izman. To say that it comes many levels later, but Zman was an interesting word the Rebbe wrote. Ribu Izman b'Pashtus means 6 days. But L'Achar Shenesav, the Rebbe wrote Ribu Izman L'Achrei Ahelam, which means L'Achrei Bereshis Bara. That makes sense, 6 days later. But Ribu Izman L'Achar Shenesav, I'm not saying a kasha chazrusham on what the Rebbe wrote. I'm just trying to create clarity. What does the Rebbe mean by Ribu Izman? So maybe one of you want to write a ha'ara on that, you could look into it and try to figure it out. I never really fully I mean, you could teach many ways. That Ribu Zman, the Rebbe Nesave, is L'mayla Mizman. Then once Zman was created, in Zman itself, it's Ribu Zman until Seif Ma'aser Bereishis. That's Bapashtus. But still, it's an interesting thing to talk about. Now, here's the thing. The word Klippah, as you know, doesn't mean Ra. Klippah means a shell. When we say Klippah, we mean like the shell. An eggshell is called a Klippah. A shell of a nut is called a Klippah. A coconut. These are shells. Almost every fruit, not every fruit, but almost every fruit has a shell. Some are soft shells, some are hard shells. You know, for example, a grape also has a shell. We call it a peel. Same thing with an olive. The harder ones are in the regular category. An egg is a shell, but it's not that hard. It's easy to crack. You get to a filbert, or nuts, or a walnut, or especially a coconut, it's very hard to crack. So that's what a klippah is. Alpi the taich of a klippah. So why do we use the word when we say klippah? Everyone right away associates klippah to the worst things. Only klippahs with sitra achra. Everyone right away taich is full of evil. That's not the taich of klippah sitra achra. I'll take it a step further. Even sitra achra. What does the Alter Rebbe write in Perek Vov, in Tanya? Sitra achra, he says, it means the other side. The Alter Rebbe says clearly it doesn't mean necessarily ra. It's just not anything that's not a keli and bottle telekus. Is sitra achra. Kedusha is defined by bittul telekus. That's the lashon of the Alter Rebbe in Perek Vov. That's the exact lashon. Let me read the exact lashon. I think that's more or less the sprach there. What does he say? He says like this. Here, right here. Shezeu pirush lashon sitra achar pirush tzad achar she'ein tzad ha'kedusha. V'tzad ha'kedusha ein ela shrov amshach mikdusha sei ve'ein ha'kosh baruch hu sheira ela dover shabbat letzleis baruch. So kedusha is something that's bottled, meaning it's not about me, it's about I'm bottled to something greater than bein b'peil bein b'keyach. However, does he feel here? Yeah, then he goes on. He speaks Nikrei Elam Hazim, Molei Klippah Sitra Achra here too. Why? Because it's not, so it's more of Helam. A Helam doesn't necessarily mean a Menagid. So Klippah therefore really means, and the same like Sitra Achra, initially, we're not talking about Ad to the point of Menagid. But what is it on its own? It's a Helam. Like for example, when you look at an egg and you see the shell, you don't know that inside it there is an actual egg, or you look at an orange or an apple, you see the peel, and imagine you wouldn't know there's a fruit within it, so you'd be deceived. It's concealing the fruit. In the language of Shalah, he writes, Klippah shemer lepri, that before Chet Eitzadas, there were klippahs, but the klippahs were shemer lepri. Everyone knew, well, everyone, there was no everyone, but I mean, if you were there, the klippah would be very clearly, has a purpose. It's protecting the fruit. In that sense, it's only a means to an end. Where the problems begin is when the Helen becomes an end in itself. The famous moshel from the Maggid that the Rebbe, the famous Sikha Tu B'Shvat Lametes, when the Rebbe was crying and speaking about how the father conceals himself from his child in order to bring out his keiches, so you should find the father. And then the child stops looking. Why? Because the father hid himself so well. So the Helen has a kavanah. Helen b'shvil agili. What happens if you forget? You see, you say to yourself, you know what? Maybe God doesn't exist. He's not here, because I can't find him. So instead of saying it's a Helen b'shvil agili, the Helen becomes an end in itself. So Klippah has two stages to it, or two components. One is that it's there to protect the fruit. Then everything is fine. If every one of us saw Elam Haza as simply a shell that protects the fruit, and the fruit is what? The alakus within it, the nitzitz alaki, we would have Mashiach. That's the world of Geula. The problem is that the world of Geula is when you don't see the aleph of alufa shalelam, so everything you see is an end in itself. You eat a meal, it's an end in itself. The divrei reshus becomes a tachlis la'atzmei, not as a shem l'pri. So that's what the Rebbe then continues here. The Ha'ara, I'm going to continue reading the Ha'ara. So what does it mean? Because it doesn't have to be menagid, but it came down to a level of menagid because basically the ra, the elam, is rooted in a misunderstanding of the concealment. I know it sounds a little like simple, but that's the truth. A misunderstanding of the purpose of Helam led to all the problems that exist in history. Every problem began with the Helam. Let me put it in a very balbat shesis. The Yerushalmi explains Avos Yisrael that just like it's impossible that a right hand would hit a left hand, right? If your right hand started hitting your left hand because it did something wrong, something goes, it's a problem. Why? Because it's all one body. So he says, Avos Yisrael, the same thing. How is it possible that one Jew can hurt another Jew? We're part of one body, one organism. The answer is because we don't feel it. Which imagine your parts of your body didn't feel they were connected. There is a thing called autoimmune diseases, where the body turns on itself. You can have a situation where, God forbid, the body sees another part of the body as an invader and it attacks it with everything it has. It's one of the worst possible diseases. But same as here. It's because you don't feel it. So in other words, it's the Helam that leads to the Hisnagdus. Machlekes wouldn't be possible if there was no Helam. Because if we all felt we're all part of one thing, how could we disagree? We have different opinions, but it's two parts of one organism. And if you bring the picture bigger, the whole world is one part of Achdus Hashem. So how is it Shaykh B'chlau there should be anything that's a stira to that? And the answer is because the whole point there was a Helam. And when the Helam is not understood and misused, the Helam can lead to the worst possible things. Which is ultimately the explanation of Chassidus, how Ra was in the Shtalshel. Because we know, Ein Ra Yered Momaila, we know that the Eibishter is Kulei Tev. So how is there Ra in this world? How could there have been a Holocaust? I mean, I'm using an extreme example, but even a simple hurt. One person hurts another person. How is it Shaykh? I'll talk about Piseichel now. We understand we're emotional creatures and we do things and we're impulsively and so on. But how is it possible if Ein Eid Milvadeh? The answer is because there's a Helam. Now, why is there a Helam? Not in order for us to go and hurt each other. The Helam is for us to be smart enough to see through the Helam that it's only a Klippah Shemer Lepri to help us actually use our keiches and megala what's behind the Helam. That there is Elokus in everything. And there is Achdus Hashem in everything. But what happens if we don't do that and we misunderstand the Helam? That's Ad Shuk Mole Klippahs V'Sitra Achra Shemenagid. Shein Meneged Hashem Mamish. And the Rebbe is teaching the Mole Klippahs V'Sitra Achra is not just an extension of Chesher Kofel Mechupel, because he says, not Ad Shein Neged Hashem Mamish, he says the Klippahs V'Sitra Achra become Neged Hashem because they're misunderstood, essentially. So I'm just going to read quickly the rest of the Ha'ara, because then it comes very clear. So it says, Ki afal pi shegam b'tchilas habriya hayu mitzias haKlippahs. So what do you mean that it came later? The beginning of creation was also mitzias haKlippahs. Hayu zeh bedugmas Klippah shemer lepri shalah. He gives them out of Mekemis. A whole bunch of them. V'achar kach al yedei hachet yordu haKlippahs liyes menagdim l'kedusha. So here you have a Klippah, and its entire role is to protect the fruit. But once you misunderstand what the purpose is, and let's say you start worshiping the Klippah. Let's say people make just a humorous example. They take they'll start worshiping orange peels. You make a whole church. You're going to worship an orange peel. So all of us would think it's like insanity, but that's essentially what Avodah Zarah is. The Rambam makes it very clear in the beginning of Hilchos Avodah Zarah. What does he say? How is it possible that they knew there's an Eibishter and mitamol there's a whole Avodah Zarah? Well, it wasn't mitamol, obviously. It took time. And he explains, very simple. They wanted to have something to connect with Hashem. They couldn't see Hashem. So they looked. Let's take the stars in heaven. So it's God's in biyad ha'chetzev. It's God's handiwork. But imagine you start looking at the art. You say, the art reminds me of the artist. But then that was also not enough. So they started looking for things on earth that reflect the art or the stars. And they started building structures around it. Then, of course, the capitalists came into the picture. Not that he doesn't call them capitalists, but business people. Let's make a business out of it. You want to go into this and this, you want to come over to this and this tree, or this stone that corresponds with this star that was created by God, there's an entrance fee. And then once that happened, it just devolved till it became an end in itself, and everyone forgot the Gazan is biyad ha'chetziv. So the same idea. It begins with maybe good intentions. The Rebbe has a sikha about Chet HaEgel. How is it possible after 39 days, standing with Moshe Behar Sinai, they should go build a Egel Azav? So I don't know if you know the sikha, but the Rebbe says, basically, they were looking for a Rebbe. They were trying to replace Moshe as a Rebbe. They felt they needed a Rebbe. So somewhere you could say there's a mocker for a good thing. The problem is they chose Egel Azav. They made it an end in itself. Not as a Mamutza Machaber, not as Bittel, but what they wanted. Essentially, Avodah Zarah, which we don't have a taiva for, because the Gemara says there's no, but we don't even have a taiva, but it was just like taivas noshim. For them, there was a taiva for Avodah Zarah. They wanted a God, but they wanted a God on their terms. That's the problem. No, it was not. So the Helam ended up becoming a Menagid. That's basically the story. So the Rebbe continues. So, but then it was Klippah. Yorda Klippah liyas menagdim l'kedusha, ad she'elam hazeh nasa elam haKlippah. That's the lashon in Tanya. It's not just elam mole Klippah; it comes elam haKlippah. So it's a world of shells. Shell themselves is only a protector, but when you make the means and end, what do we learn about parnasa? A person has to do masa matam ba'amuna. So what's the problem if a person is too much shakua, too dug in and buried into their parnasa? Like the story of the Rebbe Rashab, where he told the galoshes manufacturer, who became a wealthy man. I guess in those days there were no paved streets, so anyone who created galoshes saved a lot of shoes. So he made a lot of money. It was a great idea at the time. So the Rebbe Rashab told him, "Chigizen fisen galoshen, aber nicht a Kopf in galoshen." I saw feet in galoshes, but I never saw a head in galoshes. Meaning he saw his whole Reshe, or Kol Kulei, was busy with the galoshes. So in other words, it should be belay lev in the language that Chassidus brings. Absolutely, you have to do your business ethically, faithfully. But where should your head be? The business is only a Klippah shemer lepri. Don't worship the Klippah. It's the way the Eibishter wanted. So you have to make tasa a keli, by all means, and you have to engage with this world, but don't make it an end. It's a means to an end. It's an emtsoi. But once it became an end, Yarda Klippah limanagim l'kedusha, nasi elam haKlippah, mole Klippah l'terachah, shezeh neged Hashem mamish, shehi neged Hashem mamish. And Rebbe Tzeichens from Narizal and Maimorim, V'yeshleimer. Here's a very interesting chiddush. I'll just add this because it adds a whole another dimension. שהכוונה דנסava hoyse sheyesava elam lechatchila be'efen kazeh sheyesh b'ei hafshodias v'alulias l'ra. So here's the important step. Why did Eibishter make klippos in the first place? Why didn't he just make fruit? So we understand the reason, because we need a helam. But the whole point was, the Eibishter wanted there should be enough shodias that you should choose the wrong way. So the helam allows us to choose the wrong way, and when we do, that's when we're mahapach the chiddush that he says that you make from elam hazeh moli klippos into adira b'tachtenim. So it's hafshodias v'alulias. So he says shehelam behester zeh sheshoshu mitzim sanush she'ein nigish be'elam she'esavusei malakus. So the first step is the Eibishter concealed, and we can feel that we don't feel that the savus of the world is from Elikus. Neisness of shorish sheyi moli klippos l'terachah she'neged Hashem mamish v'ayidei achet nasa b'peil. So the first till Odom Achave the Chet Eitzadas, it was b'koyach neged Hashem, the helam, because it can go either way. You could either understand the helam as a klippah shemer lepri, or unfortunately the shariest opposite. The Chet made it b'poil moli klippos l'sitracha. V'avedas ha'odom hilasis dira b'tachtenim u'lechadesh shetizbatel gam of shari zu k'fi she'yeh b'shlemus l'osad lavi. So in other words, that l'osad lavi, that's our ultimate aveda. Not just that we're going to eliminate the concealment, but we'll also eliminate the sharius for anything the other way, other possible way. Which also explains the strange Gemara. When Moshe says to Hashem, why is it saying the Torah Nasa Odom? Loshen Rabim. Nasa? It's not Nasa Esa. There's only one Eibishter. Nasa is Loshen Rabim. People will interpret that there's a Shittuf. There's a partnership. So what does the Eibishter answer? Haretz elites yita. What kind of response is that? Modern response. What do you mean? The Chatchila planting a possibility that people want to make a mistake. Why give them the opportunity to make a mistake? Say it as to that I want to create Adam Mitzalim Elikim again. Because that's the kavanah. The Helem is beferish the kavanah that Haretz elites. You don't have to make a mistake. But there's a potential of sharias to make a mistake all the time. And of course, the wisdom, Chachamena Bereisha, is not to make the mistake. And Adarabah, to understand that the Helem is there to be mahapachet. So that is somewhat of an overview of what the meaning of Klippah is, what sitra achra, its purpose, how it came to be, and ultimately our Aveda. So bottom line is, as the Rebbe always says, is that when you see a cheshach, you see a Helem, you even see a menagid, just have to open up Tanya and say, why is there such a thing? It's here for a purpose. It's not here to just make our lives miserable and to have an enemy. It's here because that's exactly what Dira B'Tachtenim is. It's there for you to do something with it. That means you have all the kayach to do. Because the Klippah is not stronger than the pri. It's our perception is the problem. That we may not always understand what a Helem is for. We're able to see the purpose of a Helem. So I don't know if we can always expect to see a Gili and a Helem when these things are going wrong or problems and so on. And let me use this opportunity for a full shlema and miraculous recovery for Henya Bas Dvereleya. Huh? Henya Bas Rachel Dvereleya. Brachel Dvereleya, sorry. Henya Bas Brachel Dvereleya. And, we're all praying. So you don't always see the Gili and the Helem, obviously, but that's why the Rebbe says, even if you don't see it, you have to act that way. That's when you add in Teira, Avedim, Mils Chasodim, Tehillim, Trachgut. What is that doing? Trachgut means you're trying to be Megala, the good, even in the Helem, even if you don't see it. And you fully believe that ultimately it will be that way. So that's the real point here to understand. And bottom line is that whatever comes our way, we always Einem Avakashel Lefikechan. We always have the Keyach because the whole kavanah of that is only to bring out the deeper good. Unfortunately, there's been plenty of problems, we know that, but we know the story, the end story, is not just the bitl hara, but the bitl of Avsharias hara. Not just the bitl of the cheshach, but even the Avsharias. I'll be completely, Hashem Melech Chavaras, B'yemahu Hashem Echad, Shmei Echad, I'll clear achdus between the Eir and the Keli. May it be right now in Chedesh Agula, Chedesh Kislev. Everyone have a good day. I should only hear Psudas Tevis.